For more than a decade, Kenya has been trying to build one of Africa's most ambitious trade corridors, a $25 billion network of ports, railways, highways, pipelines, and industrial zones stretching from the Indian Ocean deep into East Africa. But there was one problem: who would actually use it? Because infrastructure has a brutal rule: build the road without the cargo, and the road loses money. Build the port without the ships, and the port becomes a monument. Build the pipeline without enough oil, and the pipeline becomes stranded capital. That was the problem threatening LAPSSET, until a new player entered the equation: Aliko Dangote. His proposed mega refinery at Lamu could create something LAPSSET has struggled to generate for years: a massive industrial customer. And suddenly, the question changes. This is no longer just about whether Kenya can build a refinery. It's about whether one private industrial project can generate enough economic gravity to make an entire $25 billion corridor commercially viable. Because if the refinery connects to South Sudan's oil, and Ethiopia's enormous consumer market, and Lamu's deep water port, then Kenya may have something far bigger than a refinery. It could have the beginnings of a new economic artery across East Africa. But there's a problem. The same infrastructure the refinery needs is the infrastructure LAPSSET still needs to prove it can finance. So today, we're going to stress test the entire idea. Can Dangote make LAPSSET work? Or could Lamu end up with a massive refinery and a corridor that never arrives? To understand why LAPSSET struggled for more than a decade, you have to look past the politics and look at the economics. The problem wasn't merely that governments couldn't find enough money. The core issue was bankability. Investors couldn't confidently see enough future cash flow to justify the risk, and that created a brutal, circular trap. No cargo meant weak infrastructure economics. Weak infrastructure economics meant insufficient private investment. Insufficient private investment meant incomplete infrastructure, and incomplete infrastructure meant no cargo. And this is where the economics become almost circular. LAPSSET needs cargo to justify infrastructure. But the cargo needs infrastructure before it can arrive. Do you build a billion-dollar railway before the factories exist? Do you lay down a 1,000-mile pipeline before the oil fields are fully flowing? The multi-billion-dollar question hung heavy over Nairobi, Juba, and Addis Ababa. Who goes first? LAPSSET risked becoming a permanent monument to unfulfilled potential, until a private industrialist stepped in with a completely different model. Meet Aliko Dangote. The billionaire industrialist behind West Africa's massive refining complex has now turned his sights toward the east, with a proposed refinery investment valued at roughly $16 billion. According to project plans, the proposed facility relies on a blended financing structure combining roughly 30% equity and 70% debt. With soil testing, design, and engineering work underway, construction has been targeted to break ground no later than October 2026. President William Ruto's administration has appointed a high-level government committee chaired by Deputy President Kithure Kindiki to coordinate private investment. But here's the catch. A refinery this large doesn't automatically solve LAPSSET's bankability problem. It changes the equation and potentially creates a new one. Designed with a proposed processing capacity of up to 700,000 barrels per day, the facility creates immediate demand for specific high-stakes variables: crude feedstock, port capacity, storage terminals, pipelines, electricity, roads, and refined product distribution. If the project materializes at the proposed scale, it could create something LAPSSET has struggled to manufacture on its own: predictable industrial demand. Dangote isn't waiting for LAPSSET to finish. He is attempting to build an industrial anchor that forces the region to look at the corridor through an entirely new lens. But there is a problem hiding underneath the refinery story. A refinery can create demand for infrastructure. It cannot create crude oil. And that takes us straight to South Sudan. If South Sudan represents the supply side of this equation, can those barrels actually reach Lamu competitively? South Sudan holds billions of barrels of estimated crude reserves. But oil in the ground doesn't fund a nation. Getting it to market does. Historically, its exports have relied on a single northern transit route through Sudan, a pipeline network chronically vulnerable to conflict and sabotage. LAPSSET's original blueprint promised a southern escape hatch, a pipeline stretching from Juba straight to Lamu. That brings us to the ultimate four-variable test: reserves, production, pipeline, security. If any one of those variables fails, the southern crude route remains unbankable. This creates a brilliant tension. South Sudan has a powerful strategic incentive to develop an alternative export route, but Lamu needs reliable crude volumes to justify building that pipeline. It's the exact same chicken and egg problem LAPSSET has faced from day one. If South Sudan provides the supply story, Ethiopia provides the demand story. Ethiopia represents the second economic engine of the entire LAPSSET corridor. The consumer and trade powerhouse. Landlocked Ethiopia is a nation of over 120 million people experiencing explosive industrial growth. For decades, its external trade has been overwhelmingly dependent on the corridor connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti. Lamu doesn't need to defeat Djibouti to matter. It only needs to give Ethiopia another option, and options change bargaining power. South Sudan brings the upstream crude supply. Lamu provides the coastal processing hub and maritime gateway. And Ethiopia offers the massive inland market for trade and energy distribution. Together, they form the complete triangular logic of the corridor. A second corridor can potentially provide competition, resilience, and strategic flexibility. But Ethiopia won't automatically divert trade simply because Lamu exists. The corridor has to compete on cost, reliability, transit time, security, and customs efficiency. Now LAPSSET faces another rigorous test. Can a coastal mega-refinery and an incomplete highway network actually shift the commercial gravity of the Horn of Africa? How does this story actually end? To know, we have to game out three distinct futures. The breakthrough: the Dangote refinery is built. South Sudan's production recovers, pipeline financing locks in, and Ethiopian trade flows through the north. LAPSSET finally achieves true regional network effects. The partial success: the refinery succeeds as an industrial and domestic powerhouse, but the South Sudan pipeline stalls and Ethiopia remains tied to Djibouti. Dangote succeeds. LAPSSET only partially succeeds. The stranded anchor. The refinery rises on the coast, but inland security, cross-border financing, and transport links fail to connect. The industrial facility operates as a standalone coastal enclave. The anchor exists, but the network never forms. And ultimately, every scenario comes down to one question: does the additional revenue generated by the new cargo justify the enormous capital cost of connecting it? Because this is where the Dangote story becomes much bigger than a refinery. He doesn't have to build the entire LAPSSET corridor for the project to matter. He only has to create enough predictable demand to make the next piece of infrastructure worth financing. A pipeline, a highway, a rail connection, a storage terminal, and then another industrial project, and another. That's how infrastructure networks are actually born. Not all at once. One economically viable connection at a time, but there is another possibility. The refinery could succeed while the corridor fails. Lamu could become a powerful industrial and energy hub, while South Sudan's pipeline remains stalled, Ethiopian cargo continues moving through Djibouti, and the inland network never reaches the scale its architects imagined. In that scenario, Dangote doesn't save LAPSSET. He proves something even more interesting, that the coastal anchor was viable, but the network wasn't, and that's why Dangote's proposed Lamu project should not be viewed simply as another mega investment. It is a market test, a test of whether private capital can create the commercial gravity that public infrastructure struggled to generate. Because LAPSSET was never really about building a port. It was about building a network, and networks only become powerful when one connection makes the next connection economically worthwhile. So the question is no longer, can Dangote build a refinery in Lamu? The real question is, can one private industrial anchor create enough economic gravity to pull an entire $25 billion corridor into existence? The answer will not be decided in Nairobi, or Lamu, or even Abuja. It will be decided by the cargo, by the oil, by the roads, by the pipelines, and ultimately by whether the economics work. That is the LAPSSET test.